I'm Andy Schmuckler. I'm here to talk about the tragedy of Israel. And I speak as somebody who's paid a lot of attention to Israel since I was a kid, actually. And it pains me to see what's happened. There are a lot of people in the world who are basically just antagonistic toward Israel. Uh, Especially on the left, people who think that Israel never really had a right to exist, that it was all an affront to the Arab population of the region and European imperialism, or however they want to put it. I don't see it that way. Um, but neither am I of the other substantial piece in our political process over Israel these days, where there are people who will simply say, we must support Israel. We must support Israel. I'm a big supporter of Israel. APEC exemplifies that, and a lot of politicians cover themselves with a kind of uncritical support. I'm not one of them either. I'm someplace in a uncomfortable middle with a love for the country, which I think is warranted, and a deep pain and shame about what it is doing now, has been doing since well, in some ways, since the Netanyahu coalition took over and tried to end Israeli democracy with judicial overhaul. But then they were still in power when they had to deal with the provocation that Hamas was able to devise. And at that point, Israel started paying a huge price for the fact that on August 7th, or October 7th, 2023, this fascistic part of the Israeli political spectrum was in power. If it had happened when there was a more decent government, a coalition that just was able to hold it together to stay in power for a little bit more than a year, but they were motivated by the desire to escape where Netanyahu led, so much that shared motivation enabled them to cobble together a from the left to the right coalition. And I don't know what they would have done if they had been in charge when Hamas inflicted these terrible atrocities on Israel. But I really don't believe that they would have made the same blunders and committed the same crimes, probably. I feel like we got to call it that. I don't know what the right choice would have been, but I can't believe that what the Israelis have done in response is either is justified. Like, what is the ratio of the innocent to the guilty that die because of what ratio is acceptable is a moral issue, and I don't think that this Netanyahu government has passed that moral test. But the problem goes deeper into Israel, and I'll get to that. Let me just turn to what raised this thing in my mind is how admirable and heroic so much of the early story of Israel is. I was watching the movie Exodus. Now, anybody can, I suppose, make a case that Exodus, written by Leon Uris, is a piece of propaganda. Well, yes, but it captured, I think, some essential truths about Israel. First of all, there's the heroic nature of what they were able to achieve as a society. At the level of being surrounded by like a 50-to-1 ratio of Arabs to Jews, that they were able to withstand attack from all sides. And and win a victory. It's a real David versus Goliath thing that Israel was able to survive, even though the whole Arab world rejected what the United Nations had decided would happen about the partition of Palestine into an independent Jewish state and an independent Arab state. That was rejected by the Arab side. And I think that the film Exodus captures some of that heroic stuff. But if you read about it, there was a great deal that got achieved. That if you saw the movie, you would say, that's heroism. In addition, there was the making the desert bloom. The people who were settled in this state of Israel that was able to survive being attacked by all its neighbors got to work on making something out of this piece of land that had become, in many ways, much more barren than it needed to be. And so there was a contrast that could be seen of here this new implant was sitting there in the Middle East and had this task of dealing with the dry conditions and making use of the water in such a way as to maximize the vitality of the land and how much it would produce of oranges and whatever. I didn't understand, fully what these various kibbutzim were accomplishing, but I got the picture back in the 1950s when my aunt came back from Israel, having worked on a kibbutz, that something impressive was going on there. And there was something else too. There was a humanistic element, a product of a Jewish culture that had grown up in Europe that, among other things, really sought to be menschlich, to embody decent, ethical, humane values. Because of their centuries of experience of being treated unjustly, there was a large value placed on justice, which is the protection for people in a weak position. Justice leads to people like Saul Alinsky being the organizer he was here in America, in Chicago. And it leads to a lot of other thought and practice that inform the formation of Israel as a society, where democratic norms and humane values and a respect for the rights of others at the beginnings of this new society, making it very different in terms of human values from the dictatorships that surrounded them, or in the case of Jordan, a monarchy. Israel embodied what we might reasonably call American values more than anything else in the region. And the various political players were some pretty decent people, Ben Gurion up to Golda Meir. Even when it got to be Menachem Begin, who had been in the Irgun, the violent people trying to drive out the British to make Israel possible, even Menachem Begin had a kind of integrity and a code of values and principles that, as far as I can see, are lacking in his successor as leader of the Conservative Party, the Likud, which is Bibi Netanyahu, the current prime minister. Something happened to Israel between its founding by a lot of idealistic people that came out of Europe, and the present time, where you can have a government like this one acting in a way that's going to bring shame on Israel, as far as the eye can see. And I, growing up as an American boy, taking pride in the Jewish state, not necessarily without any criticism, but back in the 50s and the 60s, I didn't find much fault because Israel really did seem to be entirely willing to create a more just peace. Um, but the Arab world responded famously with three no's: no to negotiations, no to peace, no to recognition, or something like that. I mean, it was just, they were having to deal with unflagging enmity from the Islamic world around them, which is a very big world, which was also in command of a lot of oil that gave them a lot of leverage in places like the United Nations and with American policy. This was a country that was sort of up against it. But things gradually changed. First of all, because this society had some of the characteristics that make Jewish history kind of extraordinary in the big picture. First of all, some kind of discipline such that while hundreds and hundreds of various human groups were having their cultures destroyed over the centuries, this particular people found a way to survive as a people in a world that did not cotton to people that didn't conform to the party line. That was an achievement too. But then, in addition to that, there was something else going on in the cultures. And if you look at the list of, you know, all the impact had, for better or for worse, but just thinking of the magnitude right now of the impact. You look at the list of all the Nobel Prize winners, and all the people who have played an important role in American culture since the late 19th century. It's just very disproportionate. So something's going on there, and it probably connects with the fact that pound for pound in this world of Silicon Valley kind of economic power, this is a mini superpower that has developed there. So that kind of whatever it was that got cooked up over the centuries in the Jewish culture that survived in Europe, when it was transplanted to be in charge of itself, it was able to pull some really impressive things off, like becoming the dominant power of the region. A country of 7 million people, the dominant power in a region that's populated by 50 million of enemies who don't want you to exist. Well, it happened. And that helped Israel to survive, but it also provided the temptations that go with being powerful. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Millennia of Jewish weakness led people to want justice instead of that. But once you're in a position to be the strong that do what they can and make the weak suffer what they must, well, that presents a challenge to those humane values that the culture came with. But but there are other things going on too besides the growth of Israeli power, which always provides a temptation, because every great power seems, if you look at history, abuses it, whether it's the British or the Americans, not to mention the French and the British, and back to the Romans and all that. The abuse of power is sort of the history of humankind since the beginnings of civilization, which is part of what that book's about. But anyway, Israel is further driven in the direction of becoming more broken, more ruled by sort of ugly things rather than the beautiful things that the idealists brought to the country. And part of that is that they were interacting continually with a world that was operating by a different spirit, which isn't really all that pretty out of the Arab world. It seems to me, based on what I know, there's been centuries and centuries of um, a lot of intolerance and a lot of uh, war fighting. Not that the Europeans didn't have it, but this was a people that was not inclined to say, well, the United Nations made a collective decision pretty overwhelmingly when the vote came in to create these two countries. Let's make the best of it. Who are, we're at least, free of our colonial rulers, or at least getting free. Let's make the best of it and, have a palace. No, no. There was something about how it all has to be ours, which isn't the prettiest impulse. But there it was. And the Israelis were continually dealing with that through wars that came every once in a while, and a lot of their children dying in these wars. 1973 after 1967, and the Israelis had initiated in 56, and just one thing after another. But meanwhile, then there are also these terrorist kinds of events, like the murders at Munich at the Olympics in '72. And the hijacking of an airliner and flying it down to Uganda July 3rd and 4th of 1976. All these senses of being embattled, and it became, people said, more like the Middle Eastern cultures around them. And they also became more paranoid and traumatized, newly traumatized by. Not very many people on this planet have had to live surrounded by people who say you don't have a right to exist. There are enmities in the society here and there. Different countries that sometimes have skirmishes and stuff like that. But the idea that you don't have a right to exist as a nation, Palestine free from the river to the sea, or whatever that is, getting rid of you altogether. It's kind of unique to the creation of Israel. And after all this time, and a lot of demonstration of worthiness, you would think that, and it was moving, by the way, in the direction of the region was going to accept them. The Abraham Accords that somehow the Trump people got, and it was moving toward something big with Saudi Arabia being included. And that's what Hamas wanted to stop, and succeeded in doing, thanks to what Netanyahu and company have done. So there's a bit of craziness that grew in the society as a result of living with this continuous threat over generations of being annihilated. But never having the luxury that most societies get of, we just live here. Everybody else that lives around us, they live there, and we go on with our lives. Now we got to deal with this. We draft all of our young people, the boys and the girls, 18, for mandatory service. Oh, but except for the Haredim, the yeshiva boys, the super religious, the ultra orthodox. And that's one of the battles going on in Israel right now. And that's another thing which I think has been sort of regrettable about how Israel has evolved, which is the way the place of the Orthodox in the society has given them way too much voice in the society. There are numbers you can look at, how, back when they were founded, what proportion of the population was ultra-Orthodox. And it was very small, very small. But they've been reproducing at a higher level for several generations since 1948. And they're no longer whatever it was, 2%. Now they're something like 13%. And in the Israeli political system, that kind of voting power allows the religious to be kingmakers, and that's actually the position that they've been in for a long time. So either the party is of the more progressive side, or the parties of the more uh, uh, reactionary, or at least conservative side, um, would court them after the elections to form a majority in the Knesset. And these coalitions were formed on the basis of kind of contracts. You support us on all this other stuff, and you get to say what the religious policy is. And as this group got bigger and bigger through their reproduction, partly motivated to try to repeople the Jewish population after 6 million out of what the world's 14 million back in the World War II, 6 million slaughtered. These people have been repeopling as a moral thing because of their Jewish identity. But getting that kind of clout has enabled the kind of theocrats, the elitos of the Jewish system in Israel, to warp the society further in some kind of authoritarian directions. I mean, they want to impose the way they think things should be on the Shabbos, for example, on everybody, or Shabbat, to go to the Hebrew rather than the Yiddish. The Shabbat, everybody's got this, all this has got to shut down, everybody's got to do this, and everybody's got to do that. When there's a whole lot of Israel that doesn't want to live its life according to the rabbinic. And they're able to persuade the larger society for what looked like a minor concession but became a major one, particularly when you've got such a big war as this thing, to give a pass to anybody in the young men of the ultra-Orthodox world on the basis of some claim that they're actually, they're maintaining the Jewish religion is part of the service to the core of what the Jewish state is going to be. So we've had a movement, I believe, from the Israel of Ben Gurion, which was largely a secular society, which was by a sense of identity as a people and a culture and a religion, but not the religion necessarily being the dominant thing, to the increasing empowerment of a religious kind of theocracy, so that you get arrogant rabbis like one that recently responded to there's been a whole drama about drafting these yeshiva boys. And it's been said by the high court, now it must go forward, and something's been passed for it to go forward. And this rabbi steps up and saying, basically defy it. So that's another thing which is shifted over the years since the early Israel that was governed by a labor party that was eager to make peace, into a world that's hawkish in its way of looking at things to such an extent that when it came time to respond to the provocation that Hamas inflicted on Israel, this government thought that the best way to do it was to be provoked into doing what Hamas wanted them to do. Tuchus, as it's some places said. So I've gone from being proud of Israel, well, to being a combination, but so painfully ashamed also that at this crucial moment, the worst part of the Jewish world of Israel is in power and calling the shot and making decisions that are not only, I don't know if it's reasonable to indict them as they have been indicted by the Netanyahu by the World Court or whatever, that international body. I don't know how justified, but it seems to me like it may well be justified. And it may well be justified also to be calling them out on what they're doing on the West Bank, which has been ugly for quite a while and has only gotten uglier. It's not the way the movie in Exodus, I think, realistically conveyed the desire of the spirit that founded Israel to realize better values than that. There was a time when the Arabs of Israel were really, I think, accurately said to be the only Arabs in the world or in that whole Islamic region who had the right to vote freely in free and fair elections. Now, it's true that with 20% of the population, the Arabs of Israel weren't going to be able to call the shots. But it was nonetheless set up with respect for the other. And then you get a government you get a person like Netanyahu. I don't know how important he is, but I mean, he's been so smart while being apparently pretty sociopathic that he's been able to be the prime minister of Israel longer than anybody before. And there were some reasonably long-serving prime ministers since the founding in 48, but never as long as Netanyahu. And he's smart but unprincipled is really a dangerous combination to have in a leader. He showed himself in forming this government to be willing to sacrifice Israeli democracy. And maybe in the conduct of the war, he's knowingly sacrificed the real long-term interests of Israel because that helps him stay in power and that helps him stay out of jail. Oh boy. You know, I yearn for the world to be a place where people of real virtue, like Nelson Mandela, at the end of, apartheid was this ugly thing. And then we were able to replace it by putting into power one of humanity's finest, Nelson Mandela. And a lot of good things happened. I believe I know that. But then he left the scene and things have become pretty ugly, corrupt. It's hard to maintain virtue in this world. And another factor that needs to be looked at to understand why is it that the Israelis have become these jackbooted, have become so willing to smite their enemies, so disinclined to find paths forward with their enemies that lead to the way the world ideally would be. And part of the reason also lies with the nature of their adversary. It's not a complete excuse, I want to say from the outset. A spiritually wise Israel would have been doing some very different things for the last at least 20 years than under Ariel Sharon and the Bibi Netanyahu. What happened is that Israelis gave up on the Palestinians for reasons that are kind of understandable, though I think it's never justified to just give up. You always got to be asking. And I think Jewish ethics would tell you that you always got to be asking, well, what can we do now that would give us the most likely way of making progress toward eventually getting to where we failed to get to, say, back in 2000, when President Clinton brought the Jewish Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, together at Camp David with the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They had signed this Oslo Accord thing back in the early part of Clinton's administration, and now Clinton was about to leave, and he was trying to hit a Middle East home run before he left. And he brought these two leaders to Camp David, and something kind of potentially wonderful happened. Ehud Barak put onto the table a plan for a final solution. I didn't talk about intermediate stages, I don't think. But anyway, it was a map in which the Palestinians would be getting, if I recall correctly, the analysis said 97% of the land that they have been demanding. I mean, there's a question of like 1967 borders. 1967 is when the Israelis beat all its neighbors again and seized a bunch of land like the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And he put that on the table. It was such a generous offer that he got to be in some political trouble back home, potentially. That not everybody was happy with that degree of concession. But they didn't need to worry, because Arafat's response to it wasn't to make a counter proposal and enter into negotiations. He just walked away from the whole thing. Now, I had been very much aligned with the dovish party in Israel for, I don't know, back in the 80s or at least the 90s. Peace Now was the name of a group. I mean, I was not like I did anything formal, but I would just read what was going on, and I was with Peace Now. And there are other groups that, basically this is the direction that Israel should go in. When Arafat did that, it was like the legs had been cut off from the whole dovish part of the divided Israeli electorate. The Labor Party, which is, how I would have voted all those years. I'd have voted for Ben Gurion, and, I would have voted against Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister when Sadat made his peace overture to Israel. I begin at first, but I see that he was really he was a hardliner at heart, but he was also a mensch. Where was I going? The Israelis had the opportunity, it was just wanted the opportunity to come to some kind of peace. Enough so that an Israeli prime minister could put down a proposal that would have given the PLO 97% of what they wanted as an opening offer. And Arafat walked away, and the peace movement disappeared. And the Labor Party that had been, that's where I was going, the Labor Party, which had been in power from the founding in 48 all the way up to 1977, when Menachem Begin becomes the first non-Labor prime minister. It goes from being the dominant party, and I don't know exactly how fast this happened, but it barely qualifies crossing the threshold to have any representation. I mean, they almost disappeared. And that's not unimportant in terms of helping a people, the Israeli people, elect a government with a mandate to find a way forward with these folks. We tried it. We had the Oslo Accords, but Barak laid that down at Camp David, and Arafat walked away, and then we launched an intifada. To hell with them. And then just a half dozen years later, Ariel Sharon, of all people, and I don't know the ins and outs of this decision. I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention at that point in my life. I had other stuff going on, I guess. I was launching my campaign to save American democracy from our own fascism. That's what was going on. Anyway, by some means, the Sharon government, and Sharon was somebody quite arguably a war criminal. At least he was kind of complicit with war crimes committed in Lebanon in 2002. In that war, he looked the other way when these two camps, Shatila, anyway, the Lebanese Christians conducted atrocities against Palestinian. But anyway, that was what's his name? Ariel Sharon, the prime minister of Israel, decides to leave Gaza. And he pays a big political price because the Israelis have put a whole bunch of people down on Gaza. And these settlers have a standing with the rest of the Israeli people, because a lot of people see them as, well, I don't know, a lot of the right wingers at least see them as the advance guard of Israel, claiming all the land that God gave them or whatever. But to take settlers that were there on the Gaza Strip that the Israelis had controlled since '67, and we're here now, what are we, 30 some years later. And Sharon says, we're going to abandon these settlements and leave Gaza to be governed by the Gazans. And I don't know what they thought was going to happen. But I kind of know what happened. Pretty soon, it wasn't the PLO that was in control of Gaza. They had been defeated by Hamas, which is basically a terrorist organization completely dedicated to the destruction of Israel. And so, again, I don't know how magnanimous or whatever it was to withdraw from that occupied territory. I don't know quite, but it was a backing away, a withdrawal, which is what the Palestinians have wanted the Israelis to do. They don't want to be occupied by a country that they hate. And here there's a withdrawal, and the Israelis discover that the outcome is that they've got this thing, this irredeemably antagonistic, terroristic tyranny over the Gazan people. It's not even good for the Gazans. All this money that various parts of the Arab world are trying to funnel to the Gazans so that they aren't living in such a terrible situation, it all goes into the coffers of this organization. An organization that eventually will do the unspeakable things that they did on October 7th. So that's another contribution to turning Israel into something like what we see. Now, I hate what we see. I hate the way the Israelis have dealt with this whole challenge. Again, I say that without saying I know, just exactly what the wisest course would have been taken. I just feel like I know this wasn't it. I think Israel has advanced the long-term interests of Hamas and have hurt the long-term survivability of Israel. That's the blunder aspect. Meanwhile, there's the crime aspect. They're showing what seems to me way too little concern for how do we minimize the suffering of people who didn't bring this upon themselves? It's not that easy to get something like Hamas off your back. You know, maybe there's stuff that some people could have done, but it is not easy in a situation like the Gazans were in. We've seen other people under an iron boot, and we know how much the Hamas cared about them because they just turned all these couple million Gazans into a human shield so that the Israelis couldn't touch them without killing innocent civilians. However innocent or not innocent all the civilians are. People are just trying to live their lives for the most part, and a humane society gives adequate weight to that. I don't know what the proper weight is. I mean, we as the United States have often been willing to kill innocent people, bombing German factories and stuff like that. War is not, war always requires people to weigh. But if you're morally deficient, you make morally deficient weighings. The heart of Judaism, according to Rabbi Hillel, is that which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. And it's basically the same as Christianity's golden rule. You put yourself in the other person's place. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You can't always treat everybody as well as ideal world people would be treated. But you give adequate weight to that injunction. I don't think this Israeli government has been doing that. I don't think they are spiritually capable of doing that because the Jewish nationalism that controls this coalition, people that all the rest of previous Israeli governments would never take into their government because they were beyond the pale, to use an expression. People like Ben Gvir and Smotrich who are continually holding Netanyahu hostage. If you do this decent thing, we'll bring down the government. A decent person would call their bluff or go down with that government because doing the right thing is necessary. But a sociopath knows that if his government is brought down, it will not go well for him. Nations are things in which good and evil, forces of wholeness and forces of brokenness are always contending to see which would be in control. It's a tragedy that in Israel in which I would say the forces of wholeness significantly predominated in the early years of the state under a very difficult situation, gradually have been overtaken by forces of brokenness. So the Israeli people are also complicit in this, not only because they voted for all the people who now make up this coalition, but you can see it also in, I think, in the way that the hostage situation seems to be much more bothersome to them than the way their country is trying to destroy Hamas and failing to do so, and taking so many innocent lives down in the process. There have been demonstrations against this government. But as far as I can tell, it's the hostage issue the whole question of how do you deal with hostages is a separate issue. I myself think that a certain amount of tough-mindedness is required. If the 200 and some hostages had instead just been added to those killed on October 7th, it seems that Israel would have been better able to understand its situation. It seems hard for people to consider lives that haven't ended and give them more weight than you would if they had been part of what had ended, such that preserving those lives, when so many more were lost, would lead you to sacrifice the long-term interests of the country if there was a conflict between the two of them. But that seems to be a lot of how people deal with it, and certainly it's how the Israelis have been dealing with it. And I don't fully understand how that happens, but the idea that you don't negotiate with terrorists, that idea used to have a lot of currency in the world. If it isn't uh, the path of wisdom, if you don't allow people to hold you hostage with hostages, I haven't seen it disproven, but that's sort of beside the point. The point is the Israeli people don't seem to be as upset as I wish they were. I wish I could say that what the Netanyahu government is doing in waging this war, their way of waging it, expresses only the worst of Israel, but maybe it's more widespread than that. But the Israeli people have said since the very beginning of this war they want to get rid of Netanyahu. That's what Netanyahu knows that. That's why I fear that's why the war doesn't end. But also Hamas doesn't want it to end. With Netanyahu held hostage by the Jewish nationalist fascists, the war will go on and will continue to damage Israel in the eyes of the world. The tragedy of Israel. I went to Israel in 2017, and I saw that even with Netanyahu as the prime minister, and had been for whatever it was, 8 or 9 years by then, there was just a whole lot that was wonderful about the country. You could see that the wonderfulness that went into forming it was still there in creating a lot of the realities that were in the society. But at the realm of power, at the realm of how do you treat your enemies or the people who oppose you, at the realm of how do you regard war and peace, the wrong part of Israel has taken control. And the better parts of Israel will have to regain control. And the sad thing is, I don't know how it will go in terms of, I watched what happened in Germany after World War II. And I wonder what's going to happen in Russia after the shameful things that they have been doing the last couple of years have to be processed. But Israel's probably going to have to live down for some time what they've done in this situation. The world has been watching, and it doesn't like what it sees, and I don't like what I see either. The painfulness of this is partly a function of this is going to be a legitimate need to repair and repent, like the Germans had to do in the decades. I mean, not to compare what the Israelis have done with way off the charts Nazis in Germany, but enough so that there's going to be a stain that needs to be processed and lived down, and it's going to take a long while. And I realized that when I was watching Exodus, to remember that heroic country and realize how it's stained itself. But it's not just any country that's it is staining itself. It's the country that's the world's one Jewish state. And we've got a historic problem in the civilized world called anti-Semitism that has been, I don't know, a pathology that's been embedded in the cultural system and handed down through the generations for centuries. I've looked at the phenomenon as much as I could, got stuff to say about what it means and where it came from, but it is a historical phenomenon at any rate, and I don't claim to have penetrated the full mystery of this particular pathology. But we know, because we could see it surfacing, at the same time as there was this legitimate protest against what Israel was doing, there were these ugly things rising up with it that, told you that it's feeding the flames of an ancient disease in our civilization of anti-Semitism. So that's an unfortunate thing too, and why it's somewhat painful, and why it doesn't. It's not without risk to come forward like I am saying. I was born to Jewish parents in 1946, and they were born to 4 Jewish grandparents that immigrated over here. And even though I'm not an observant Jew, I am a product of a culture that I've been proud of in some ways. And that now I find it harder to be proud than I have because of the tragedy of Israel. Thank you. If you are interested in various ways in which I put together the big picture of how the force of brokenness and the force of wholeness have been battling each other since the rise of civilization, of which this drama in Israel is a particular playing out of that. Please go, look at my various, follow me, support, subscribe, whatever. Send the link to other people if you would. And my original craft isn't just a guy who monologues, it's a disciplined writer who writes books like those 2 there, a few others that are behind my head. And go to abetterhumanstory.org and see how I've put together an integrated picture that bears upon the wide struggle between these 2 forces, including the struggle that is coming to a showdown in the American presidential election, and including the larger struggle about whether we're going to order our civilization as a whole well enough and soon enough that we can survive on this planet for the long haul rather than destroy ourselves. Those are the kinds of stakes that are involved in the battle that I'm trying to provide an integrated picture of. The tragedy of Israel. I would love to see the better parts of Israel because there's so much there that's beautiful. Take power again and begin the process of healing Israel and the traumatized people and also the relationship with its neighbors, including the Palestinians, whose rights they have not treated with sufficient respect.